Hello, my name is Brian. I'm a philosopher and a cognitive scientist, and I work on issues to do with sex and gender and sexuality and identity. And these are topics that, as you've probably seen, are playing out in the public discussion quite a lot. And much of that discussion seems very negative or vitriolic, and you might be standing on the sidelines wondering what to think or what you're allowed to think, how it makes sense to reason through what it means, for example, to be a man or a woman or to count as a member of one sex category or another. What does it mean to say that somebody is male or female? Does it have to do with certain bodily attributes? Which ones? Um, I asked on Twitter the other day whether people would find it helpful if I tried to map out some of the territory of these debates, not to give any hard and fast answers, but just to try to clarify some of the main sources of disagreement, what seems to be at stake in the disagreement, and so forth. And then hopefully you would be able to feel a little bit more equipped to think for yourself about how best to reason through these very difficult topics. And maybe if you interact with somebody who seems to hold a different view to your own, rather than descending into name calling or whatever, you might instead feel like you could identify where the source of the disagreement was, and then maybe have a more productive conversation. So I'm going to try to do this in one take and just be as concise as possible. So bear with me and let's see what happens. One way to characterize what's going on in the public discussion right now is that there seems to be a fundamental disagreement about what it is to be, for example, a man or a woman. And I want to suggest that when people seem to be making different claims about ontology, which is just a philosophical term referring to what exists, the study of what there fundamentally is in the world. So when people seem to be disagreeing about what there is, this is often a conceptual issue that's built on top of lower level facts that these people probably don't disagree on. And so sometimes it can be helpful when there are people appearing to talk past each other to go down a few levels and see what's down in the basement where you can get some shared footing and where people seem to agree on what we're talking about. So for the moment, I'm not going to start by defining terms. I'm not going to say, here's what I mean by gender, here's what I mean by gender identity, here's what I mean by sex or sex categorizations, male or female. Instead, I'm going to try to pretend that you and I are having a conversation, maybe at a bar, we've just met each other, and you want to know what gender I am. And this is going to be a somewhat stylized conversation. Probably this is not how it would play out between any real human beings. Certainly not in this current climate, but I'm going to belabor some points just so that you can start to see how I'm building this model from the ground up, and then we can begin to see where it is that people are really disagreeing with each other. So let's say that you've just asked me, Brian, what's your gender? I could try to anticipate what I think you're trying to find out about me or what I expect that you want me to say, or I could just answer with what I feel the answer is. But for our purposes, what I would want to do is ask you a question in return. I would say, what is it specifically that you want to know about me? What are you trying to find out about me by asking about my gender? There are a number of things you might say in response, and what I would answer back would change potentially depending on what exactly you asked. So I'm going to run through some possible things you might ask me, and then I'll give you some answers. I'll try to be truthful about these answers. I'll give little thumbnail sketches. You don't need to know my whole life history. But just so you can get a sense of how this might go. I'll also be taking coffee breaks throughout, so there we are. Brian, what's your gender? Okay. What is it that you want to know about me? You might say, I'm trying to find out if you are chromosomally disposed to getting a disease that people with XY chromosomes tend to get. And if you ask me that question, I could just skip all the metaphysical stuff about gender and say, oh, well, for purposes of this line of interrogation, I can just answer that I have XY chromosomes, or I presume I have XY chromosomes. I haven't checked. And now we can go to the next question that you have. What specifically is it that you're trying to find out about me? You might say, I'm trying to find out if your naturally occurring testosterone levels are situated somewhere on a upper or lower bell of a bimodal distribution of testosterone levels compared to the species average? Again, nobody would really ask the question in that way, but suppose that that's more or less what you're trying to find out. Well, again, I can just answer the question. I don't have to refer to gender or sex or any of those things. I can say, I presume that my naturally occurring testosterone levels are somewhere on the upper bell of this bimodal distribution, probably not on the very far end of it. It's maybe somewhere in the middle. I don't know, but to answer that question is not to have a metaphysical dispute or a debate about what fundamentally exists. There's just a descriptive, kind of boring answer to that question. You just have to measure my testosterone levels, and then you'll find out what the answer is. And so nobody would disagree about the answer to that question if the measurement was a proper measurement. Now maybe you want to say something like, I want to know whether you can engage in penile vaginal intercourse unassisted. Maybe this is a date or something and you're trying to figure out where it's headed. I can answer this functional question, so I could let you know that under the right conditions, I would be able to engage in penile vaginal intercourse if there was consensual and so forth. Maybe you want to know whether I can get pregnant. And to answer that question, I could say no. I don't have a uterus or fallopian tubes. I don't have the relevant bodily features that would enable me to become pregnant. This is a very searching interview. You really are trying to learn a lot about me. So maybe next you want to know whether I'm capable of growing a beard. Well, you can just see for yourself that I am capable of that. So you might be asking about what's sometimes called secondary sex characteristics. And let's say that we have a pretty good map now of my bodily features. You've asked all the different things that have to do with my reproductive system, my sexed body parts, and so forth. And now we can move into the realm of my mind. Maybe you want to ask me a question like this. I want to know whether you find yourself intuitively and irresistibly drawn toward and resonating with ways of behaving, dressing, interacting with others, engaging with cultural artifacts and so forth that are stereotypically or characteristically feminized in our culture, that are seen to be feminine in nature or masculine. And I could answer that question. Now, as you can see, I have short hair, I have a beard, so some aspects of my presentation are certainly consistent with things that are stereotypically masculine in my culture, which is the United States. There are other aspects of my life that don't fit the mold, so I could tell you some of my upbringing, and I could say, well, when I was in middle school, I didn't really understand people who acted in a very masculine way and were very domineering. It seemed kind of silly to me. And a lot of my friends were girls, and I sometimes felt more comfortable in this situation or that situation, and I could kind of walk you through the story. But I think almost everybody, if they were to answer this question in a rich and robust way, would have to take a little bit of time, and they would have to reflect on different aspects of their inner mental life that seem to resonate with feminine or feminized aspects of the culture, or things that are stereotypically considered to be masculine. And most people probably have some combination of both of these things or fall along a spectrum, and it might change from time to time or whatever. So some people would have a very strong answer where they would say that I just overwhelmingly find myself very strongly attracted to things that are almost exclusively stereotypically feminine in our culture. Others might say I'm very strongly and exclusively finding myself to be drawn toward and irresistibly understand my own lived experience in terms of things that are characterized as masculine in our culture. But again, most people have probably some complex combination of these things. You might ask other questions about my mental life or about perhaps my socialization. So you could say, I want to know whether you were raised in a male or female gender role. And again, it's not a metaphysically complicated answer. It's a long answer. It's an answer that would involve my telling you about my childhood. So I might say something like, well, in my household, my dad did much of the cooking. My mom made certain household decisions. I played with dolls when I was a kid, but I also played with trucks. I read all the Babysitter Club books because my sisters had those on the shelf, and I'd already read all the Hardy Boys books, and so on and so forth. And then I might say something about how I could see that there were certain scripts or expectations in the society, scripts having to do with being a boy, that I saw pertain to me or were meant to apply to me, and some aspects of those scripts I felt cool with and seemed to make sense. A lot of those aspects I didn't feel very comfortable with, and I didn't like the characteristically boy things that were being presented to me by my society. Again, there's not an on or off switch or a yes or a no answer here. There's just a long story that I would tell you about what my upbringing was like and how I related to the scripts and the norms and the expectations of my society that are for what boys and girls are supposed to be like. You could ask a personal question about how I would like you to relate to me. So, what would be a means of showing me respect in terms of my own gendered self-understanding? So you could say, would you like me to use certain pronouns to address you? Do you want me to invite you to certain types of events that are segregated for men or women? And I could answer those questions, and you would get a sense of what I would regard as respectful behavior toward myself and my self-conception. You could ask questions that are a little bit more outside my mental attributes. You could ask about, for example, whether I'm a recipient of male privilege or feminine disadvantage. And the answer to that question is not metaphysically complicated. Again, it's an empirical sociological question. I assume because I read as or function socially as a man, that insofar as people who are widely perceived to be men or males in our society are characteristically advantaged along certain dimensions, I am very likely advantaged along those dimensions. You could ask a legal question, do I count as a man legally? And the answer to that question just depends on whatever the rules are in a given jurisdiction. So in the United States, I don't know what the rules are, but I assume that I count as a man in the United States for legal purposes. So now we've had this very long conversation. We're 3 drinks in, and I've shared all this stuff about my childhood. I've told you about my body, all the different bodily attributes that I have that are relevant to our conversation. I've tried to tell you a lot about my inner mental life, my psychological traits, and I've told you about my socialization, sort of social facts about me that have to do with how I'm situated within social systems, some of which is sort of beyond my control. Now imagine that by spelling out all this information, I've in essence given you very precise coordinates for where I sit in multidimensional gendered space. So it doesn't matter what you call this space. You can call it just the space of the conversation we're having. And we don't need to talk about whether it's gendered space or sexed space or anything, at least not for right now. But I've positioned myself in these very precise coordinates where every dimension that you've learned about me has a pretty precise, metaphysically uninteresting, empirically determinative, at least in principle, determinable answer. So what exactly are my testosterone levels on this distribution? Well, you go along and you mark off wherever my measured testosterone levels are. Do I have XY chromosomes or XX chromosomes? And then there's some other combinations of chromosomes. XO, for example, is Turner syndrome. There's not very many people who have this fact pertain to them. But there's a specific answer. So I assume I have XY chromosomes, so I would be there on that dimension. Imagine that we were talking about genitals, external reproductive features, and you wanted to be able to include in the conversation people who had genital structures that were not characteristically or stereotypically masculine or feminine. So let's say you had somebody sometimes characterized as intersex or somebody with a difference of sex development who had a genital structure that's not clearly a penis or a clitoris. It's somewhere in the middle. Now, this just shows how pervasive our language is in encouraging us to categorize things based on what's statistically common, and then forgetting that that's just a shorthand discussion. All of us have a clitoropenis. There's this one organ in early fetal development that usually in response to testosterone will diverge and grow and become longer. And if you have a long version of this organ, we call it by convention a penis. And if you have a short version of this organ, we call it by convention a clitoris. But sometimes in the course of development, this organ will pause somewhere in the middle. The urethra may or may not route through. And then what you have is something that's not conventionally a penis or a clitoris. It's just a clitoropenis, like we all have, of a certain length. And so, again, if we're not so obsessed with the language that we're using, we can just say, how long is your clitoropenis? And all of us have a precise answer to that question. So we don't have to categorize it in any particular way. We can just give the descriptive information. My clitoropenis is X number of centimeters long, and everybody will have an answer to that who has this organ. So here's where we are in the conversation. I've given you a descriptive, metaphysically uncontroversial, answer to all of your questions. Some of them involve very long stories, so those might be a little hard to summarize on a number scale or something like that. But basically, I've positioned myself in this multidimensional space. And now imagine that you said, okay, so then what's your gender? And it might seem like now kind of an ill-posed question. It's like, I've already told you all the possible things you might want to know about my body, my mental states, and my social standing. So to then come down and say what my gender is, as though there's just one fact of the matter about what that is, it doesn't seem like you'd be getting any more information that way. You'd rather be asking for a very shorthand summary of a whole lot of complex information that I just shared with you. And depending on what it was that you wanted to know and toward what end, I could have given you a different specific answer. But now you're asking this kind of omnibus question that's meant to summarize all this up. And this is where the disagreement begins to happen. Because basically, different people think that different of these dimensions should be given more weight in determining who gets to count as a member of the social category, man or woman, for some purpose or another. And so let's say that you're really strong in the transgender ally community, and you're concerned with the fact that people who have transgender identities, who are trying to live out the gender that they regard themselves as, and by which they understand their experience and can make coherent their inner life, are subjected to violence and mistreatment and stigmatization and are not taken seriously and can often suffer very severely because of that. Well, you might think that the dimension that should be given the most weight for deciding who counts as a member of the social category, woman or man, there are other categories we could refer to, and I'll come back to those, is the dimension having to do with the psychological attributes that I talked about, my inner life. So something about how I relate to irresistibly and am drawn toward things that are masculinized and feminized in my culture. And it might also have to do with the dimension of what I regard as respectful behavior toward myself. And essentially, if you're on this side of the debate, you would say that these couple of dimensions should be given essentially all of the weight, such that insofar as you sincerely regard yourself as a man or a woman, by virtue of that alone, you are a man or a woman. I would say it a little bit differently. I would say by virtue of that, you count as a member of the social category, man or woman, because I don't think there's a fundamental ontological fact, because man or woman is just a sound we make with our mouth. It's a bit of language we use to carve up this very complicated biopsychosocial space for some purpose or another. And because it's true that there are statistical regularities where certain physical and mental attributes cluster together statistically in mathematical space, you have two main clusters. One that by convention we refer to as male or masculine, another set of clusters that we refer to as feminine, because we are sexually reproducing species, which means that there are underlying causal reasons why it is that there are primarily people with XX or XY chromosomes, and that the downstream effects of having XX or XY chromosomes, along with the way that hormones play out during early fetal development, lead to clusters of attributes that, by and large, hang together in a recognizable fashion out there in the world. But which of these dimensions through which you could divide up these clusters are the ones that matter for the social purposes of determining who counts as a member of a social category? Well, that's more of a pragmatic question. That's a question of, why do we care about distinguishing men and women or males and females in the first place? The answer to that turns out to be different depending on your specific purpose. To get away from the politics of men and women for a second, let me just give an example of imagine you're a scientist and you're trying to run an experiment where you want to see whether a given drug will have a different effect on male or female rats. Well, if you think about it, this drug is not going to be having an effect on maleness or femaleness of the rats. That wouldn't make any sense. It's a chemical, so it's going to be interacting with chemicals in the rats. And so let's just talk about testosterone levels or estrogen levels, let's say. You might be interested in which rats are the relatively high estrogen rats. Maybe you have a more sophisticated question where it's not just overall levels you're interested in, but let's simplify. You want the high estrogen rats and the low estrogen rats, and you want to see whether this drug interacts differently with this, again, bimodally occurring distribution of estrogen levels. Well, what you should do is not pick up the rats and look to see which one has a penis and which one has a vulva. That's a proxy that you could do. It's a rough pass proxy for the thing you're really interested in, and it'll get you most of the way there. But if you're a good scientist, what you should do is just directly measure the estrogen levels, and then you should put the high estrogen rats over here and the low estrogen rats over there, and then you run your experiment. And what you'll find when you've divided up the rats this way is that some of the high estrogen rats are going to have a penis, if you have enough rats, and some of the low estrogen rats or the high testosterone rats are going to have a vulva. But that it doesn't matter. For the purposes of the experiment, you were never interested in penises and vulvas. You're interested in testosterone levels. Similarly, when we have segregation in society where it matters whether some group of people are characterized as male or female, we're going to give a different answer to which features matter for that distinction depending on what we're trying to do. So in the world of sex distinctions, those come out of the scientific field of biology primarily, and it's just because biologists are predominantly interested in certain kinds of explanatory questions. They're interested in the fact that we're a sexually reproducing species as opposed to asexually reproducing species. And so the features of our organisms that are most salient to biologists, the ones that they think are most important for drawing dividing lines, are the ones that help us explain why it is that we are able to reproduce sexually. And so they're concerned with typically physical or biological attributes that help explain that. And so, again, for rough and ready purposes, biologists will distinguish between male and female members of the species, but that word, male or female, is just, again, a rough proxy that's referring to a whole cluster of different attributes that mostly hang together in the vast majority of cases in a recognizable way, but with all sorts of different exceptions and gradations and variations along these dimensions, so that for different purposes, maybe social purposes or political purposes or legal purposes, it might very well be that different attributes are the ones that are more appropriate for grounding membership in the social category, man or woman. So I mentioned the view of those who are strongly committed to creating a safe world for people with various ways of being gender nonconforming. The word transgender is really a big umbrella term that refers to a lot of different people who have a lot of different things going on and have different life stories. And the best thing to do if you meet somebody who says, I'm a transgender this, or I'm a trans that, or I'm non-binary, or whatever, is just to talk to them and hear their story and let them tell you what's important about their life. There's, I think, a risk of conflating a lot of very different stories under this one term or this one umbrella term, because it's essentially a political term that's trying to carve out space in the discourse for promoting protections for a marginalized group of people. And then there's a question of who counts as a member of that marginalized group. Okay, on the other side of the debate, there are people who go by various names, and they're all controversial, but among the less controversial names would be gender critical feminists or sometimes second wave feminists. And they have a different purpose. So their purpose is something like tearing down male supremacy. They want to fight the patriarchy. That's maybe their primary political purpose. And from their perspective, in order to fight male supremacy, which involves people being perceived as having certain reproductive features being systematically treated differently in a society, so people who are perceived from a young age to have female reproductive features tend to be systematically disadvantaged along numerous dimensions in societies that are patriarchal, that are characterized by male dominance. And so for their purposes, the features that should count, or that are most salient or most important for their purposes to decide who counts as a member of the social category woman, is going to be more to do with being perceived as having certain reproductive features, and less to do with how the person regards themselves from the inside out. For the purposes of this video, I'm not going to try to weigh in on one side or the other, because I think that that's essentially a political dispute. What political considerations you find to be most important or most pressing or most weighty are the ones that are going to shape which of these dimensions I mentioned earlier are, to your mind, the most important for grounding membership in the relevant social category. But the way that I would like to think about things, and what I hope is helpful for some of you who are watching, is instead of getting so caught up on ontological claims, who is a man, who is a woman, we could instead use language that has to do with what attributes do people have. And we can go down to that level where people will agree. They'll say that whatever your view is about whether I count as a man or a woman, for all intents and purposes, the easiest answer to that is I count as a man. I certainly function socially as a man. I have all sorts of complicated stuff going on in terms of my gendered thoughts and feelings and so forth. But and so depending on the conversation, maybe those attributes would come to the fore. But whatever you think the answer is to that question, we can all agree that I can grow a beard. We can all agree that I have certain bodily characteristics. We can all agree that I'm a recipient of male privilege, however it is that I might identify inside, or whichever pronouns I might prefer that you use for me. So if, when we're having these big vitriolic disputes, we could move away from these really weighty metaphysical claims about what it is to be a man or a woman, and instead say we are all people with properties. We are all people with attributes. And most of those attributes, there's very little disagreement about what attributes a person has. What the disagreement about is which of those attributes are the ones that should, and that's a moral question, that's a political question, that should count with the most weight for grounding membership in a social category. And what social categories are for, to repeat this point, is some pragmatic purpose or another. The reason why we draw distinctions between males and females has a different answer when you're dealing with, say, reproductive medicine. In that case, what you want to know is who has a uterus, let's say. You might be more concerned with who has a uterus than who identifies as a man or a woman, because sometimes those things are going to come apart. You might have somebody who identifies as a man, or understands their inner life best by characterizing themselves in terms of these qualities that are recognized in the culture as being masculine. Some of those people might have a uterus, and if you're a doctor who's trying to figure out how to treat your patient, it's that fact that's the most relevant for how you should categorize this person. You should categorize them as a person with a uterus. For questions about who should be able to get to use what bathroom, I'm not going to wade into that debate, but you would have to ask yourself, why do we have different bathrooms in the first place? I don't know the history entirely. I have read up a little bit about it. But let's assume that there's some valid reason for having gender-segregated bathrooms. Maybe there isn't. Maybe we should have just gender-neutral bathrooms or single stalls or something like that. But assuming that there's a valid reason for having men's and women's bathrooms, we should ask ourselves, what is the point of having this segregation? And if it's a valid point, which I don't know whether it is, then you have to say which features of a person are the ones that are relevant to that particular distinction, which might be different to the distinction that's relevant for reproductive medicine. So you might say, for the purposes of using this bathroom over that bathroom, what's relevant is, I don't know what it is. It's certainly not going to be anybody's chromosomes. It's may have to do with how the person identifies in terms of their gender identity. It might have to be a kind of a mode of respect or accommodation. It might have to do with certain outward attributes or how somebody uses the toilet or whatever it is. But there's going to be specific features that are relevant to that question. And then there's going to be political debates about which features are most important, because people maybe have different attitudes about what bathroom segregation is all about in the first place. This also comes up in the world of sports. So you might ask, why do we have men's professional basketball and women's professional basketball? The original reason for that probably was that if you only had one league that was for the people who were the best at scoring the most points in basketball, probably more than 99% of those people would be what in common sense language we would refer to as men. They would be people with penises who have XY chromosomes, who regard themselves as men, who are socially treated as men, who are recipients of male privilege, and so forth, just because there are, again, a bimodal distribution of certain physical attributes that are relevant to how high you can jump or how tall you are, let's say. If that's the way that the society is arranged, then there aren't going to be female role models for little girls who might want to grow up and be basketball players. And so one reason, anyway, why you might have a men's and women's league is to create a separate space for where you can have very capable and high point scoring women players to serve as role models for little girls, let's say. So then you might have a question where somebody has some of the attributes that are characteristically associated with being a man, but not others, or characteristically associated with being a woman, but not others. And then you might have a question about, well, which league should they get to play in? And I don't think that the answer to that question has really much to do with whether the person is really a man or a woman, because that's the whole thing that's being disputed. That's what everybody can't seem to agree about. What's relevant to that question is, which features does this person have that are relevant to the reason why we have a men's versus women's league in the first place? We're calling them men's and women's leagues for shorthand, but we if we wanted to characterize them in terms of the relevant features, it would be something like the really tall people league and the slightly less tall people league, or the highest jumpers league and the less high jumpers league, or whatever is the relevant criterion. And as it happens, that corresponds as a pretty good proxy to what in everyday language we refer to as men or women. And the historical purpose of having this league might have been to create female role models for girls. And so it works well enough to talk about men's and women's leagues. But the answer to the question of which league should someone play in, I think, is not usually going to be down to does the person themselves regard themselves as a man or a woman, or is the person really a man or a woman, which again is the very thing that's in dispute in this kind of debate. So I hope I haven't shown my hand too much about the way that I think about this. It's also a work in progress for me. I'm constantly learning from people who have a wide range of views on this topic, and I'm trying not to leap to conclusions. But if I've provided any service at all, I hope that this discussion gives you some tools for thinking about what we agree on, all of us, is that there are people with properties. A lot of these properties cluster together statistically, and for certain social purposes, it's useful to, by convention, refer to a given cluster as male for shorthand, or female for shorthand, or masculine or feminine for shorthand. But the question of who really is a man or a woman is not actually a scientific question. There's no manness written in my genes. My being a man is a way of positioning me within a recognized social category, and I have most of the attributes that typically are used for grounding membership in that category. But there are other attributes I have that are not typical of that category, and a lot of my inner mental life may not correspond to masculine stereotypes. Nevertheless, I can answer the specific questions about my male privilege or which bodily features I have or what have you. So I don't know if that's been helpful. Hopefully this gives some light and not just heat. And let me know what you think. I'm willing to put up another video if there are particular criticisms I should respond to or whatever. And good luck out there.